I grew up in one of the most enchanted places on earth. Brooklyn, New York of the 1950s. I lived in an apartment above a toy store on Coney Island Avenue in Brooklyn. And if you went down the little staircase onto Coney Island Avenue, you would encounter people literally from all over the world. I remember my father would sit down at the table and he'd give us the account of who moved into the neighborhood. We have some Polish people who moved into the neighborhood, some French people moved into the neighborhood, some refugees moved into the neighborhood. I thought refugees were from the country of refuge. We were all crammed into this little apartment. We didn't know we were poor. We just knew we had to hustle. And my parents did. They were hard workers. My mom had 2 part-time jobs at any given time, but she was always home to make dinner for us. And we had a little bitty kitchen. And what was interesting is that right across from our window lived Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. And I recall on a spring day, it was a beautiful, bright spring day, I was standing at the windowsill in my kitchen looking into Mrs. Schneider's kitchen, and Mrs. Schneider was making something. And she had a kind of very 1950s colored dress on with short sleeves, and she had an apron on, and she was stirring and she was adding things. So it turned out she was making what are called rugelach. I can best describe them as a kind of Eastern European pastry, very flaky and delectable. And it's made, the ingredients are, walnuts and raisins and cinnamon and sugar and a little bit of flour. And she'd be mixing this in this bowl with some butter. And then she was rolling out some dough. And then she would cut the dough into triangles. Then she'd begin dropping some of the ingredients in and rolling them into crescents, effectively, and placing them on a cookie sheet, which she then slid into her Wedgwood oven. And pretty soon the fragrance was wafting from her window into my window, and I was frankly mesmerized by the undulating motions of back and forth inside the oven and outside. And during this whole period of time, Mrs. Schneider didn't look at me once. She was busy about making the rugelach until the end. And that's when she pulled out this tray of rugelach. And then she looked directly at me and she said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." And so I scampered up over my windowsill and walked the 2 or 3 steps to her windowsill and held out my greedy little hands. And she placed the napkin on my hands and she proceeded to place these warm, luscious rugelach into the napkin. And I could smell them and feel the warmth of them. And as Mrs. Schneider did this, I noticed on her bare arm, there were a series of blue tattooed numbers that were on her forearm. And I didn't know what that meant. I'm kind of confused, and to be honest with you, I was really concentrating on the rugelach. I thanked her and went back into my kitchen and immediately wrapped them up nicely and moved the bread box just a little bit so I could slide them in the back of the bread box and kind of put the bread box back into position so that my siblings wouldn't know that they were there. The Siricos raised no dumb children. And I remember my mother was working around the house that day, and she was half paying attention to me in the kitchen, and I told her that Mrs. Schneider had given me these goodies, and I said, "But Mom, why does Mrs. Schneider have blue numbers on her arm?"
Mrs. Schneider gave me some rugelach.
Oh, okay, good.
Can I ask you something?
Sure, what's that?
Why does she have these numbers on her arm?
Well, let's talk.
And she sat me down at our kitchen table. And she said, you know when you watch the Western movies on television on Saturday morning?
That you watch with the cowboys and Indians.
And I said, yeah.
Yeah.
And she said, you know how the cowboys will catch a calf? I said, yeah, they lasso them and they turn them upside down. She said, then what do they do? I said, well, then they brand them.
He brands the calf.
And she said, and why do they brand them?
I know.
And I said, well,
He brands
so that all the other cowboys will know who owns this calf. And she said, that's what some people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. They thought they owned them, and they could do that to them. That's what those numbers are. They're branded. And I was horrified. I don't remember if my mother elaborated on that, but I do remember my initial, visceral, instinctual repulsion that anyone would treat another human being like an animal. You know, that conversation I had with my mother that day formed the way I viewed everything else that unfolded. It caused me to see the civil rights movement in a whole new way. When I saw kids being beaten up or had dogs sicked on them or hosed down with fire hoses because they wanted to eat at a Woolworths. When I saw the unfolding of what happened in Cuba or in the Vietnam War or in China, as I began to observe the world around me, I observed all of it from the lens of who human beings are and their dignity, their inherent dignity. Now, for a number of those years, especially for me in the 70s, I was very much about activism and defending human rights and defending the justice of people. I can't say from my perspective now that I understood it all as well as I understood it now, but the primary motivator of all of that was this anthropological vision that unless we understand who human beings are, unless we get the anthropology right, no matter what political or economic systems we put in place, unless we get that right, we don't get anything else right. Right in that whole experience and what I learned became the seed of what I would later found in the Acton Institute, but really it became the grounding of my whole understanding of human relationships, namely that human beings have a dignity beyond their utility, that human beings have an inherent dignity that's part and parcel of who they are because they are. And what this lesson in anthropology taught me about economics is that to have any kind of economic system that could be called just, could be worthy of the human person, it has to have the human being at the center, so that human beings are not instrumental for someone else and for their use and their utility. But economics is the action that human beings take on behalf of themselves and upon behalf of their families for human betterment, for human flourishing. So really this whole encounter that I have, the whole memory, contain the seeds of what I understand to be an authentic understanding of economics as well. You know, my mother didn't have an 8th grade education, but in that moment, she communicated to me the most profound lesson in moral theology and moral philosophy that I have ever had from that day to this day. And it really all goes back to that dish of rugula that Mrs. Schneider gave me that spring day.